other reports. So it is a report of reports. Its data is mostly objective, although it does rely on some subjective reports. And the composition of the index itself is transparent. Now, this is important because it does mean that other academics can try altering the weights and try and produce different results. But over the years, they found that the current composition, which is a neutral composition, has really supported its function, which is capturing the essence of economic freedom. The key elements to the report are 5 areas, and we have speakers today addressing 4 of those, going into a little bit more detail. Those areas are, 1, the size of government. It answers the question whether if a government was to tax 100% of your money, you certainly would not be economically free. To have no tax, no government would be ultimately economically free. And then we have area 2, which is the security of person and property rights. We will be exploring that in more detail, very relevant to South Africa. Area 3 is sound money. A country cannot exist without a secure currency to depend on. And then we have in area 4, freedom to trade. We live in a global world, and we can measure our ability to engage with that world. And then area 5 is quite a substantial category. It measures regulation and red tape, and we can see to what degree businesses and labor are regulated within a given economy. Now, a couple of years ago, there was a correction, a change in methodology to the report, whereby a gender coefficient was introduced in the area 2, which is the secure property rights. Sadly, around the world, women are not allowed to engage in the economy in the same way that men are. And this unfairly ranked some countries that prejudiced their women and gave them a higher ranking in the index than was deserved. So a couple of years ago, they introduced the gender coefficient, which uses a particular survey by the World Bank that measures to what degree women are allowed to own property, engage in business, be a director, have to rely on their husband for the transfer of property and so on. And this gender coefficient is then, or rather the area 2 score is halved and multiplied by the gender coefficient. So those countries that do particularly poorly by not granting their women equal rights will then get a correspondingly lower area 2 score. Now, since the Economic Freedom of the World report has been put out there, a number of academic papers have based their reports on their studies using the Economic Freedom Index as a variable in their report. And in 2014, the author, Dr. Robert Lawson and Hall, produced a survey of the literature, and they found over 600 reports that used the Economic Freedom of the World Index. So it's cited in very, very many academic reports, and the results are overwhelming. The simple conclusion is that the more economic freedom that you have, the more of everything else that is desirable you are likely to have. That includes longevity, better healthcare, better education, better wealth. That is quite stark in the income levels of various countries. So if we split the world into quartiles, we see that the upper quartile earns something like $50,000 a year, where the lower quartile will earn something like $5,000 a year. So there is a 10x difference between the first quartile and the fourth quartile. Importantly, the poor in the first quartile earn something like $14,000 per year. In the bottom quartile, they would earn $1.5 thousand a year. Again, that's sort of an 8 to 10 times difference. So if you're going to be poor, you'd want to be poor in an economically free country. If you live in an economically free country in the top quartile, you're likely to live to 81 years old. Living in the bottom quartile, you'll be lucky to hit 66. These things matter. One criticism of economic freedom, leveled unfairly, is one of income inequality. The claim would be that economic freedom, the higher levels of economic freedom, would create higher levels of inequality. And that's not borne out by the statistics. The lowest percentage of the income levels in all of the different streams is around 2.5% for extreme poverty. and that's spread evenly across economically free countries and economically unfree countries. So inequality is not explained by economic freedom. Now, we move on to this year's report. The number of countries this year has been increased by 3, and we now have 165 jurisdictions in the report. And the report also this year is notable for including a chapter from South Africa. The global report includes that. That hasn't been done for 18 years, so it's quite an honor. 18 years ago, I had the honor of producing a chapter based on the software that I'd produced. And this year, we look to Martin van Staden at the Free Market Foundation, who has produced a very important chapter on expropriation without compensation. So I do draw your attention to that. Moving on to the results. South Africa is placed 84 again, almost level with Nigeria as a country. This is almost exactly in the middle of the global rankings. So South Africa would appear to be a very sort of mediocre, average country. Although I think what is important here is that the trend is important rather than our current position. And unfortunately, South Africa does appear to be on a slide. The top 10 countries are Hong Kong, Switzerland, New Zealand, Georgia, the US, Ireland, Lithuania, Australia, and Denmark. Overall, we can say that world economic freedom has increased this year. That is good news. Our neighbors are Botswana at 45, it's the highest ranking, Namibia at 95, Eswatini at 136, Lesotho at 112, and Zimbabwe at 161. So South Africa does not sit in a particularly good neighborhood or a particularly free neighborhood. So South Africa should reconsider its current policies. We have one of the worst labor statistics in the report in the world, and correspondingly, we have the worst unemployment in the world. We definitely as a country need to look at the report and recognize what it is telling us. We should look at the expropriation of property. We had water rights and mineral rights expropriated previously, and now our government is considering the expropriation without compensation of land. We have relatively high inflation. We are considering policies of localization, of protectionism, when we should be looking at free trade in Africa. Our government is in crisis and they are desperately in need of ideas. So we hope today that this report offers more evidence that pursuing different policies would actually lead to better results. What I'd like to do now is introduce our first speaker, who's going to be digging down into more detail into Area 1, the size of government. I would like to introduce Phumlani Majosi. He's a business and macroeconomics analyst and a writer and commentator on economic and political issues. He's been published in the City Press, Biz News, African Liberty, and Politics Web. He's also a contributor on News 24 and sits on the board of 2 organizations, the South African Institute of Business Accountants and the Organization Undoing Tax Abuse. So please welcome Phumlani.
Thank you, Neil. It's great to be here to talk about this very important topic. I think you've laid everything out quite well, Neil. So you are very much gifted. I'm looking at a very interesting chart here. The data is from the IMF and the World Bank. I think it was compiled by one of the professors at Wits. And this chart lays out the African rates of tax. And when you look at the company taxes, personal taxes, South Africa is ahead. It's at the top. Other words, we are leading. We have in those taxes, we have the highest taxes basically. We are higher than Zambia. We are higher than Mozambique. We are higher than Namibia, Angola, Madagascar, Botswana, Mauritius as well. So in other words, we have the highest tax rates according to this data I have here. And that tells you, in fact, even by the way, the size of government as a percentage of GDP, South Africa is also ahead when you look at the data. And that tells you that we all know that taxes aren't really a good an increase in taxes is not a good policy, especially if you have a repressed economy like South Africa's that grows at less than 1%. I think South Africa last grew at a rate of plus minus 2% way back in 2013 or so. So we haven't had good economic growth at all over the past decade now, because of very much these policies that are repressing economic growth. We've seen taxes over the past decade continuously rising and rising and rising, which hasn't been good, because that has been accompanied by rising unemployment rates as well. Right now, as we speak, about two-thirds of the youth, they don't have the jobs in the country. As we speak, unemployment rates have continued to rise over the past decade or so. All this, by the way, this happens as the size of government has continuously increased over the past 27 years of our democracy. When you look at what the third administration under Jacob Zuma, you look at the expansion of the state there. I think it was very much stunning how the size of the state was increased under Zuma. To give you a practical example, when you look at the size of the cabinet, which of course, to finance that cabinet, you will need to get increase in taxes. You need to finance those things through tax increases. So that was one sort of example of how the size of the state has continued to increase in South Africa over the past 27 years. And I think you mentioned something very important, Nick, and that is, it's not about where we are, the state of or the position in the economic freedom of the world, but it's about the trend. That's the most important thing. And when you look at South Africa's trend, it's been very much troubling, because we were at a better position in that EFW about 20 years ago. We were in a better position than where we are today. So that tells you that the trend is quite troubling, and that decline has been accompanied by dismal economic growth, increased government spending. Government debt is projected to rise to plus minus 90% over the next 3-4 years or so. We've seen more regulations in the country, the labor market. When you look at the labor market regulations 25 years ago, then where we are now, I'm telling you, it's really shocking. It's stunning how much government has continued to sort of expand the regulations in that market. You could look at the Labor Relations Act, which has, in many ways, they've continued to put more and more regulations in the market. You look at the recent, the passing of the national minimum wage a few years back, which basically, I don't know how to pass a national minimum wage in a country that has, amongst the major emerging markets, the highest unemployment rate. How do you do that? Where you have 2/3 of young people not being able to get jobs, they don't have to wake up in the morning and earn income. How do you put such laws in a country as ours? So the one thing has been clear in South Africa, and that is, as we see government continuing to expand in its size, and also in terms of the regulatory environment, as we see taxes continuing to rise, whether it's VAT taxes or personal income taxes and so on, we have continued to witness the dismal economic performance that we are seeing right now. And that, of course, is measured through growth rates and unemployment rates as well. And by the way, also to a very much big extent, the current crime levels that we see in the country. The state of the economy, the dire state of the economy does contribute to that. And up until we address those challenges, up until we understand, we have politicians who understand that as you continuously expand the size of government, as South Africa is doing, we are going to have a serious problem. Just one thing to highlight, Neil, and that is, when you look at 20 years ago or so, our position was better in that EFW. We had a better score, right? Now, let me highlight something here. 20 years ago, we didn't have the levels of unemployment that we have today. Of course, they were bad. It wasn't good because we were still in the double digits on unemployment rates. But now things have gotten worse, right? So in other words, as we see our score not improving and getting worse, that trend going in the negative direction, we are also seeing, very, very, higher unemployment rates. Now, I'm not saying that I'm just highlighting. I'm not saying one causes the other, but I'm just highlighting that there's much work to be done, as you highlighted earlier, and we need to embrace and pursue policies that will basically open up the market and ensure that we relax the regulations, that we cut the taxes. Because if you're talking about the size of government, and we are saying we need to reduce the size of government, then we need to start by reducing those taxes, cut the tax rates, so that we have an efficient and government that works for the people and does things that it has to do, not things that it shouldn't do. Because governments now, they do things that they shouldn't be doing. So that will just be my summary from the size of government perspective. I'll therefore then hand back to Neil.
Okay, thank you, Phumlani. Yes, the size of government is probably the ultimate, as we've said, difference between being ultimately free and ultimately a slave. So we sit somewhere on that scale, and it's hugely important. Our next speaker is going to address area 2 in the report, which is the security of personal rights and property rights. He's eminently qualified to talk on the subject, as he is a former judge of the Supreme Court of South Africa and the current chairman of the Free Market Foundation. He's the author of 3 books. The second one, Miracle is Not Enough, in 1998, dealt with the failures then already evident in the South African democracy. And the third book, Panic for Democracy, in 2009, deals with the equivalent failures evident in the democracy of the United States. So please welcome to explain the issues for the legal system of property rights, Rex van Schalkwyk.
Thank you, Neil. Excuse me. Thank you, Neil. The topic of my discussion this morning is property rights and the law. And it might have been thought that I would again, as others have done before me, deal with the question of expropriation without compensation. That is not my intention, partially because Martin has already very adequately dealt with this issue in a chapter that appears in the EFW report, that very comprehensive report that has been put out and made available quite recently. So it is not my intention to deal with the property rights and the law from that perspective. Rather, I've decided to deal with it from the perspective of a view that was expressed by Murray Rothbard some years ago. And he categorized the right of personal liberty as a sub-species, as a characteristic of personal ownership. In the state of liberty, he contended the individual possesses self-ownership, and the property in your person belongs to no one but yourself. Now, there are 2 distinct incidents that appear to be unrelated, but that I want to conjoin because of the relevance of those 2 incidents, international incidents, from the perspective of self-ownership and the way in which the rights of self-ownership and the rights of liberty have simultaneously been eroded. The first of these events was the event of 9/11, of which we have just very recently commemorated the 20th anniversary. The second event is far more recent than that, but is still with us. And that is the COVID-19 phenomenon, which started at the beginning of 2020. And as I say, that event is still with us. The first event is the one that I want to deal with first. And as we all know, that event gave rise to some very significant changes in the legal structures, both in the United States and around the world. Also, it was the start of what was called the War of Terror, the War on Terror. And we know how that war on terror has ended quite ignominiously in the last several weeks. So one would say that the war on terror, which was once described by an individual as the first time in the history of the world, the history of warfare, that a war has been declared against an abstract noun. But the war against terror was carried on mostly in the Middle East, and also more particularly in Afghanistan. And as I've said, it has ended ignominiously for those who proposed and put forward that idea. Now, Friedrich von Hayek wrote, and I want to quote from his views, "Emergencies have always been the pretext on which the safeguards of individual liberty have been eroded. And once they are suspended, it is not difficult for anyone who has assumed emergency powers to see to it that the emergency will persist." That is a very insightful view by a very insightful individual. And it is something that I would want the audience to bear in mind as I take you through the various developments that have occurred in connection with both the aftermath of 9/11 and in connection with the COVID-19 phenomenon. The Patriot Act was signed soon after, in fact, within weeks after the attack on America. It is a very substantial document. It contains some hundreds of pages. I think it's as many as 700 pages. And some of the Congress men and women admitted that they hadn't had a chance properly to study the act before it was passed. Also, I think it is worth observing that the Patriot Act is rather unfortunately named. It gives a hint of what its true intention is. And very frequently, those who proclaim patriotism have something else in mind, as in this particular case. Now, it is well known that the Patriot Act contains some draconian provisions, including detention without trial, especially detention without trial for indefinite periods for, among others, for people of foreign descent. And the ignominious developments in Guantanamo Bay and that incarceration center became the center of some worldwide attention as a direct result of this enabling statute, which enabled this kind of intervention in respect of personal freedom. The Patriot Act also gave rise to some very significant surveillance, excuse me, rights of surveillance, rights of surveillance, which have been very extensively debated and for me now to enter into that debate. But it gave rise to something else, which I think is almost as sinister, if not indeed as sinister as the surveillance state itself. And that is what I
think, shall we just check if Rex's internet is going to come back there? Okay, I think we've lost him temporarily, so we may have to come back to that subject. So area 2 is, Rex, are you back? Rex, could you confirm if you can hear us okay? Okay, we seem to have, oh. Apologies there, Rex. Can you hear us? If you could just unmute there, Rex.
Okay.
There we go. Yes, okay, go ahead.
So various countries around the world enacted similar legislation to that of the United States. And this also gave rise to similar erosion of personal freedoms and the right of personal ownership. So the principle which I have extracted from what I call the law of adverse presumptions is that everyone is presumed to be on the wrong side of the law. Now how does that occur? Well, we know, for instance, that we've all experienced, I'm sure that we've all experienced the intrusive right which the state, through its agencies, exercises at all the airports and in particular the international airports, and in particular the airports of the United States, which have a very bad reputation for the manner of interrogation by the security people, and also for the type of personal body searches which have been undertaken in respect of airline passenger travel. Now, one would think, of course, that airline passenger travel is something that should be readily undertaken by anybody without let or hindrance. But because 9/11 was occasioned by people who managed illicitly to convey certain weapons onto an aircraft, everybody now is presumed to have that kind of potentiality. And it is a potentiality that covers every single traveler by air around the world. Another intrusion which has been brought about by the consequences of the Patriot Act is the so-called FICA Act in South Africa, the Financial Intelligence Act. Now, that act has enabled the government to enlist the support, the active support of the various financial centers, the banks, the financial advisory services, estate agents and the like, are appointed essentially as agents of the government to enforce the law. And what the law requires is that individuals must surrender personal information of a confidential nature, in order to establish the fact that they are not either full-time criminals, or that the money that they are using for their own purpose has not been the product of some form of organized crime. Well, once again, the individuals who are affected by this kind of legislation, and the legislation is worldwide, I suspect, have found themselves in a position where they are presumed to be miscreants of the kind that the law is attempting to subvert. Well, again, we find ourselves in a position where the law itself has made an assumption against innocence and against the vast majority of the population, which simply does not fit the reality of the situation. I'm afraid it sounds as though I've got some noise in the background.
It's fine, Rex, you can continue. We can hear you clearly.
Can I continue? Sorry, thank you. Now, these regulatory changes have been introduced and modified from time to time in accordance with international standards, which are now set out, and mostly these international standards are stipulated by the United States in the interest of combating money laundering and the like. Now we come to the question of COVID-19. That, as I said, was an event that occurred at the beginning of last year, 2020. And what happened was that the world, in a most extraordinary show of unity, engaged in what is totally unprecedented in the history of the world. The lockdowns, which occurred almost all the way around the world, with some rare exceptions, such as Switzerland, such as Sweden and Taiwan, has become a feature of life. It was previously said to be something that was required for the purpose of keeping the pandemic, as it was called, under control for a brief period of time, during which the medical services would be brought up to scratch. Well, that undertaking was not fulfilled, not in any of the countries that engaged in the lockdown. But the effect of the lockdown was to treat everybody as though they were either a carrier of the disease or in some way afflicted in such a way that it was in their own self-interest that they should be. Once again, we find ourselves in a position where the world is subjected to the law of adverse presumptions, such as I mentioned before. We were all presumed to be in the same boat. Now, whatever one may say about the medical history of the Corona-19 virus, it certainly hasn't proved to be nearly as fatal or as serious as some of the most dire predictions had actually suggested. It also hasn't proven to be anything like as serious as the Spanish flu, which occurred more than 3/4 of a century ago. But in the case of the Spanish flu, the matter was dealt with more or less in the way in which Sweden had dealt with the present crisis. Those who were in danger and those who were at risk of passing the disease on to others were isolated from the rest of the population. The remainder of the population was left free to continue with business as usual. Now, the effect of these lockdowns has been dire indeed. It has been psychologically very serious upon the mentality of the vast majority of people who've been subjected to it. But it has had enormous economic consequences. It has had property right consequences. And those consequences have afflicted people across a broad range of the spectrum, including in every sense, small and medium-sized businesses, but even large-scale businesses. These businesses many of them have been permanently destroyed, never to recover. And this is a huge disadvantage to the entire society, and it is a particular disadvantage to those individuals who've had their property rights destroyed in this fashion. So it is with great sadness and great apprehension that one looks to the future to see to what extent these types of laws of adverse presumptions are going to be continued into the future. And it was a sense of apprehension that I feel that in the light of what Friedrich von Hayek has had to say, that there's every likelihood that the government will seize on every opportunity in order to expand its influence. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Rex. That is a tremendously important part of the report and a feature of the world in the last 18 months. It should be mentioned that the data in this year's report actually only goes back to 2019. It's always an 18-month delay because of its reliance on other reports that have to be published. So we're yet to see the impact of 2020 and the COVID virus in the report. But I think Rex is right to highlight the incredible imposition that governments have imposed on our freedoms in the last 18 months and how pliable society has been under those conditions. We move on now to Chris Hatting, who will be talking on the area of freedom to trade. Chris is the Deputy Director at the Free Market Foundation, and he's the representative at the Global Trade and Innovation Policy Alliance. He's a member of the Advisory Council of the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity, as well as a Senior Fellow at African Liberty. Please welcome Chris Hatting.
Good morning, Neil, and to the fellow panelists and to everyone in attendance with us. Thank you very much for being with us. I have to follow Rex van Schalkwyk, so no mean feat. Hopefully I can also provide some useful information with my section on freedom to trade. I do have a presentation that I will share with all of you right now. So freedom to trade and South Africa's story on the EFW, trade isn't just about the movement of goods and services and capital, but also about the movement of people. Given South Africa's current predicaments in terms of social and economic problems, we need much more inflow of capital in terms of financial capital, but also people's expertise and skills. We need to make it a lot easier for people to come to South Africa and to apply their minds and various skills to the problems that we face. Just an overview. So South Africa's supply chains in the month of July, we saw with the sporadic violence and looting in KZN and Gauteng, just how important our supply chains are. And it's not just about big corporates and big businesses. Supply chains stretch all the way down to the lady on the street corner selling fruits and vegetables and where she acquires those and that she sells them onto her customers, who in turn use those to feed their families and ensure that their families can engage in economic activity. We saw just how much our supply chains can be disrupted by violence and looting. Heading out of COVID-19, we hope that more countries will be open to trade, and those countries which are more open to trade and which facilitate easier trade will take advantage of more economic freedom and growth in the coming months and years. In our modern world, freedom to trade with people in other countries is an important ingredient of economic freedom. When governments impose restrictions that reduce the ability of their residents to engage in voluntary exchange with people in other countries, economic freedom is diminished. To get a high rating in this area on the EFW, a country must have low tariffs, easy clearance and efficient administration of customs, a freely convertible currency, and few controls on the movement of physical and human capital. Developing countries such as South Africa are even more reliant on international trade, and we can take more benefit from it if we are more open to various forms of trade. South Africa's rank on the EFW. So in terms of area of freedom to trade, we are ranked 116th of the total, a score of 6.50. Freedom to trade is composed of the following metrics: tariffs, revenue from trade taxes, mean tariff trade rate, standard deviation of tariff rates, regulatory trade barriers, which are non-tariff trade barriers. That's things like corruption and the length of time it takes to get a permit, compliance costs of importing and exporting, and black market exchange rates, controls of the movement of capital and people, such as financial openness, capital controls, and freedom of foreigners to visit. South Africa's rank versus other countries, you'll see here. So South Africa, again, 116th, score of 6.5. Botswana, 60th, so a good score for them. Brazil, 93rd. Cameroon, 156. China, 106th, so China could be doing a lot better. Even though they've experienced a lot of economic growth, they could be doing a lot better. Cote d'Ivoire, 150th. Ethiopia, 148th. Ethiopia, an African country with lots of potential for growth and success stories, but they need to take advantage of more trade. India, 141st. Kenya, 108th. And the best African country, Mauritius, at 19th with a score of 8.5. So how can South Africa improve its freedom to trade ranking on the EFW? South Africa's ports do not have a good story to tell. According to the 2021 World Bank and IHS Markit Global Container Port Performance Index, South Africa's ports ranks as follows out of 351 facilities: Cape Town at 347, PE at 348, and Durban at 349. There are concerns, of course, around cybersecurity. With the latest Transnet hack, we hope that those systems are now better protected and better protections are in place. There are talks of reforms at Transnet regarding the Independent Ports Authority and possible private investment. In a recent interview with Business Day's Peter Bruce, Minister Pravin Gordhan spoke about the potential to get private investment involved in the port sector. But will the private sector investors and operations be allowed to operate free from political interference, unlike South Africa's SOEs, which have been ravaged by political interference and other corruption-related matters? So the ports, of course, that facilitates a lot of inflow of goods into South Africa and a lot of exports. These need to be improved very quickly if South Africa is to improve its ranking on the EFW. Tackling non-tariff trade barriers such as corruption, permit complexity and delays, and also transport costs. And these are things such as dangerous roads, but also lowering taxes that increase the fuel price, and specifically the fuel levy that government takes as a part of the petrol price. These things all contribute to make trade more difficult, and government can remove a lot of its own barriers and restrictions and regulations in lowering these for both small, medium, and big businesses. South Africa must implement and push the AfCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. That is a potential market of $3.4 trillion. There's a lot of potential for sub-Saharan Africa to take advantage of increased trade through improved manufacturing capacity. And to do that, again, we need to bring in lots of capital to be invested in sub-Saharan African countries. South Africa must protect property rights, that is of both local and international citizens and investors. That will ensure that people have more incentive to invest over the long term in South Africa. And finally, to improve, South Africa must abandon localization master plans. These will inevitably provide subsidies for bigger businesses and exclude small to medium businesses from markets. And we need to make sure that we don't artificially increase the prices of goods and services by imposing higher tariffs on imported goods into South Africa. The pitfalls of localization. To take advantage of the benefits of free trade, South Africa needs to seriously reconsider its master plans. Localization can be achieved in two ways, either by increasing tariffs on imported goods, thus increasing their costs for consumers who are already under great financial strain, or by subsidizing local goods, in turn protecting those producers from competition and increasing the chances of corruption, as only certain producers and businesses are favored. Neither of these options are likely to achieve the desired beneficial results. Instead of yet more grants and increased dependence on the state, and again through localization subsidies, meaningful job and wealth creation can be achieved by embracing free trade. The commodities boom will only last so long, and South Africa has been offered some fiscal space by the commodities boom, but we need to implement the pro-trade reforms now so that we can benefit from our networks and manufacturing capacity. Our path forward is prosperity through trade versus decline through protectionism. According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, foreign direct investment inflows into South Africa in 2020 almost halved to $2.5 billion from $4.6 billion in 2019, which was a 15% decline from around $5.4 billion in 2018. So President Ramaphosa and government, there are lots of talks often about talk shops and summits and getting investment into the country. But at the end of the day, capital flows much like a river along the path of least resistance. And so that the South African government, it is incumbent upon the South African government to remove as many barriers to investment into the country as possible. Easier trade means the easier flow of both financial and human capital, skills, expertise, and ideas. With that, I will end my section. Again, thank you all very much for being with us today. Neil, back to you.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I think what you've illustrated there is how the report itself can be used to understand what local policy implementation must mean. You can work your way through the economic freedom of the world metrics, as you showed there, and identify the specific policies that a country is following and whether they conform or not with economic freedom. And as you say, South Africa has been a relatively open economy, but current talk is one of shutting down and localizing. We would have to watch that. It would impact on our score. We move now to the final category in the report, which is the regulation of labor, credit and business. To speak to us on that, we have John Dludlu, who is the former Sowetan editor and currently CEO of the Small Business Institute. And his varied career includes positions at the Business Day, and he's been involved in teaching, journalism, corporate and public affairs, and is a master's graduate of the Rhodes University. So to talk on the friction that government introduces into the economy, please welcome John Dludlu.
Thank you very much, Neil, and to fellow panelists. And thank you for inviting us to participate in this. I would like to congratulate the Free Market Foundation for organizing this world-class event. It's very important that we have reports and discussions like this because they keep us honest and on our toes. I want to limit my remarks to the area of small business in South Africa, how regulation and deregulation can assist, and how red tape is stifling the growth of SMEs in South Africa. In a study that we did 2.5 years ago, we found that 98% of the South African economy is made up of small businesses, both informal and the formal sector ones. However, their contribution to employment is pitiful. It's like 28%. Now that makes us as an economy an outlier economy, because in very successful and progressive economies, SMEs tend to contribute anything between 60 and 80% of jobs in the economy. Now that's also, to put this into context, the NDP, National Development Plan, says by 2030, we should be creating 90% of all jobs in South Africa from the small business segment of the economy. And yet we're continuing to stifle their growth. How are we doing this? Through red tape mainly, and layering one piece of legislation upon another piece of legislation. Let me just give you an example. There is now a new amendment to the National Small Enterprise Act, which is envisaged, and it will create a new institution called the SME Ombudsperson. Now we know that in our country, we have a very poor track record of creating new institutions. It's going to take years, and we're going to create new industries about how to access the help that is envisaged in this new institution. And we've abandoned very good and well-intentioned policies such as Section 18 of the National Small Business Act. What this section says is, it says that for every minister, government department, whether it's local government, before you contemplate a new legislation, you must do an impact assessment on how it's going to affect the small business segment of the economy. Since 1995, we haven't implemented this act. In fact, we have now abandoned it, this section, almost completely. Instead of the regulatory impact assessment, we're doing a socio-economic impact assessment, which is less rigorous. Now, if you look at the report does not paint a very good picture, but it merely confirms what we already know, especially as SME operators. In a study in 2013, we found that SME owners were spending as much as 9 working days a month just on complying with regulations, bylaws, especially at the local government level. That's where the problem is biggest. So we have slipped on both regulation as well as on red tape. However, the picture is not that bad. Let me end by giving my thoughts about what could be done. I think it's good that as many people, right from the president to the new councillors which are going to be elected, everyone is now talking about red tape reduction. But we have to move from talking to doing. What needs to be done? First, I think we need to revert to that Section 18 of the Small Business Act and make every minister, every government minister must be a minister of small business in our country. They must think small first before they layer out new regulations and new laws. And then the second idea is to actually ask the ecosystem itself what works, what does not work. So we are proposing, and we'll be proposing this afternoon at NEDLEC, SME work stream, that government must actually go out and partner with the private sector in asking the SME ecosystem what works and what does not work. And obviously, lastly, there's a huge opportunity that is coming to fix dysfunctional municipalities on November 1 through electing people who are close to the communities and people who really, really prioritize the small business segment of the economy. I thank you. Back to you, Neil.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Yes, I think the biggest issue in South Africa today is unemployment. And I'm at least pleased to see that the report recognizes that fact in 2 metrics in that category that you've discussed here, collective bargaining and hiring and firing practices. South Africa scores the worst in the world. So if we are ever to meaningfully impact on unemployment, we are going to have to address the elephant in the room, which is the sort of the labour legislation that has effect in this country. That concludes our panel speakers. We are now happy to open the floor to questions, which we will be taking via Zoom and YouTube. We've got various people showing on our Zoom panels here. And if anybody would like to ask a question, you can maybe show your video screen and raise your hand. Otherwise, you are free to raise questions in the chat system. I'll now open up the floor. As I say, don't be shy. I think this could be technically challenging. We will wait a moment just to get some feedback.
Sorry, Neil, can I ask a question to one of the fellow panelists?
That would be great. Let's spur some additional debate.
I'm sure other people will follow behind me as well. My question is to Chris. The talk of localization, Chris, you know, some people say that we need to grow our industries. We need to invest in our entrepreneurs. We need to, you know, develop our own talent in the country. And that if we allow for competition from China, China provides very much free goods into the country. And those free goods, they kill our industries, most of them, the competition in pricing and all that, and in quality as well. What is your response to those people who fear the Chinese goods are now flowing into the country, that they will kill our industries, and therefore we must localize as much as possible?
Thank you for putting me on the spot, Pumlani. I always appreciate your very sharp wit and your sharp questions. So now I have to deal with that question. Look, I think that's a very good argument that people bring up in favor of localization often, and we should take it seriously because people often worry that maybe more trade will lead to high unemployment, for example. In my view, trade is win-win. So, for example, if there are cheaper goods coming in, South African consumers have more spare money to invest in other things, possibly in education, in their own skills development. Whereas when they're forced to buy from perhaps inefficient local suppliers, maybe they don't have as much disposable income to spend on other things. I very much think government has a role to play in terms of clear and objective and easy to understand regulation. So if government, for example, wants to say you invest in South Africa on these terms, at least be clear on those terms and make sure that it doesn't favor only the politically connected. So make sure that big corporates that from South Africa, from China, from the US who invest here, that they don't get favorable, for example, subsidies or tax breaks. So there's definitely a role for government to play there. But also I think we should look at bringing in the skills that other countries have. So it might be a case of where we make it easier right now for Chinese investors, Chinese businesses and manufacturers to invest, but hopefully they come here and we make sure that it's on such terms that they invest in the development of South African manufacturers, businesses, that kind of thing. They bring their own expertise from their country, the challenges they've faced, and South African businesses and manufacturers can see if they can apply it in the South African context. So I very much think there's a case to be made for some measure of objective regulation, easy to understand. I'm not advocating for a particular free-for-all, as it were, but I think we should rather encourage more trade than less.
Chris, while you're in that vein, we have a question that's been put forward. If I can read it out, it says, how can South Africa take advantage of international trade with its own policies when much of the world is moving towards protectionism?
Yeah, I think about protectionist policies as are often couched in the rhetoric of this will be to protect our consumers because other countries are protecting their consumers. I think that's a lose-lose. It's punishing both local consumers and foreign consumers. Just because another country wants to cut off their citizens' economic freedom at the knees doesn't mean South Africa should do the same. Now, when other countries subsidize their goods, their exports, that kind of thing, that means that they can often import it into other countries through cheaper ways. But the economic effects of that are going to be hurting that country in the long run. So China, for example, which has pursued lots of subsidies for some businesses, they're feeling the economic crunch a lot now, and they're having to turn to measures which limit their economic freedom. And again, it's going to hurt their growing low to middle income classes. So billions of Chinese people are now aspiring to higher levels, higher standard of living, but China is turning inward because of its past policies of subsidies, and it's going to hurt those consumers, again putting more political pressure on the Chinese party. I think South Africa should look at just making sure that the playing field is level, as it were. We can do that through the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. South Africa can improve and lead the way for sub-Saharan Africa to be a real hub of trade and development, science and technological innovation, and that then we shouldn't worry too much about the anti-growth policies that countries around the world implement. We should make it, our first priority should be making it as easy as possible for our fellow citizens to improve their own lives, and we do that through making it easier for them to trade with each other and with the world. Other countries might go the opposite direction, and it's going to be to their ultimate detriment.
Thank you, Chris. I'll take the next question. It says, with regards to wealth income inequality, would it be fair to assume that the Gini coefficient only represents the access to resources within a specific community, as opposed to true income wealth inequality? I'm not entirely sure what the focus of the question is there, but I would mention that that the Gini coefficient does not correlate well with the economic freedom of the world index. So if you were to plot economic freedom on the one axis and the Gini coefficient on the other, it is not a good predictor, unlike many other economic variables, of the Gini coefficient. In other words, economic freedom does not point to income inequality. You can equally have income inequality in a very unfair country or a very large government country. So economic income inequality and wealth inequality come from other policies, not economic freedom directly. What I would mention in this year's report is that there is a chapter on mobility within equality bands. And I think that's very, very important. It might be true that you start off poor in a given society, but what is important is how easy it is to migrate from one band of wealth income, let's say, to another band. And their economic freedom does correlate well with income mobility. And I think that's a policy area that we should explore in this country much more. We want to look at the fluidness, the movement between bands, rather than specific levels themselves. That doesn't really tell us very much. I'll move on to the next question. It says, what can the average South African do to support the necessary policy changes that we need? Phumlani, would you like to address that one? What can the average South African do?
I was about to jump in, Neil, and say I'm taking that one. I think you see, it's what I have been preaching over the past year on social media, that if you're talking about the average South African, really they don't have much they don't have corporate power, and they don't have political power to change policy. At least that they can do it directly. They don't have that power, but they do have a power to vote for people who are not that hostile, to economic freedom, private property rights, low taxes, small size of government, deregulated labor market, business. If the voter wants, if the average South African wants change in the country, then they will need to exercise that via their vote. There are various political parties in South Africa. Some are in the far left, some are in the left-wing center, some right center, and you can already sense from those spectrums, as to who amongst those people, if they were given power, to govern the country, who would be less hostile to business and be pro-market. In other words, do things that will improve our score in them, or our rankings in them, in the EFW. You can already see in these political parties, and therefore I am saying that the people must vote wisely, and by wisely I mean they can bring the change if they put people who will advance the pro-market ideals. And also, let's remember this, not only via the vote as well. I think the organizations like the Free Market Foundation, I think they are doing amazing work, right? And others as well, to try and bring about change and to hold government accountable, to say that, no, these policies aren't working. This is what we need to do. You are failing then. This is how the country can be, improved. This is what people should learn from in understanding the pro-market environment and pro-market policies. So it's basically there's the voter, and there's also what the NGOs can do as well, in my view, to change the country.
Thank you. I think that's also where the Economic Freedom Report actually can provide some nuance as well. I mean, people might find themselves on one side of a political debate or on the other side, as you said. But if you explore the actual data, you can see that you can have very nuanced policies. And we can see that in countries like the Scandis, Norway and Sweden, where they have very high levels of economic freedom, which might surprise people, but while still maintaining a highly developmental state, or a very large state, a very large welfare state. So you may find yourself on the left or the right, but with a particular preference, while you may still be able to support very free market and open policies, because they do in fact pay for everything else. We have another question. The impact of July's looting and violence lingers. What role do your speakers think government should take, if any, to get business back on their feet? And outside of getting back on your feet, what steps do your speakers think would preempt a repeat of what happened in July? As I think this is also very much a property rights issue. Rex, can I direct this one at you? What can we do to get back on our feet? Aha.
Yes, Neil, you can direct the one at me. It is essentially a political question rather than a legal one, but I'm very happy to delve into the politics of the matter as well as the law. The problem with trying to find a solution to ex post facto, after the event of the July riots that occurred in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng with such devastating effect, is that the requirement essentially rests upon a change in approach on the part of the government. And I'm afraid that what we saw there was not merely an opportunistic rioting and looting and destruction of property by various people who had various agendas of their own, including perhaps also the one of discontent about the Jacob Zuma sentencing. There is an overriding sense of disquiet about non-delivery, services that are not provided by various municipalities. We see these service delivery protests around the country all the time. It has in fact become a phenomenon of the South African landscape. And in the wake of these protests, we see destroyed or neglected or utterly unused public facilities which are not made available by the various authorities because the money is not there. The money has been used for other purposes, mostly for private corrupt purposes. And there's simply now no more money available to provide the services that are required, including sewerage works, including the purification of water, including the delivery of water even. So it does surprise me that the temperature of the broad public has raised to such an extent that there's a feeling of not just disquiet, but almost of rebellion. And I think that a lot of what we saw in July was not just a riotous assembly of people who seemed to want to go on the rampage. I think there was an underlying sense of rebellion against the inadequacy of government policies and the inadequacy of service delivery at the local level. And until those issues are addressed, it seems to me that it's a futile idea of thinking that one can talk one's way out of this. I know that the government is very much inclined to appoint a commission of inquiry into events of this kind, and eventually the commission of inquiry will report in 2 or 3 years' time, at which time the thing will become entirely academic and redundant and will have been overtaken by other events. So I think really what we need is a cleaning out of the administration. We need to destroy the monster of corruption, and it is a monster and it is universal. It's taken over the entire country. And having done that, we need to set about, and I don't know whether, when I say we, I mean we collectively, because I don't see that the government has got much impetus in that direction. But collectively, what is required is we need to put these matters right, and then people need to get the kind of services that they paid for and that they believe they deserve. Well, that's a long-term project, and I'm afraid that I'm not very sanguine about the short term in this regard.
Thank you, Rex. Okay.
Neil, sorry, can I jump in here just to, sorry, I want to go back to the question I answered earlier about the average voter and what private citizens can do. You know, there's a very interesting case here. Solidarity, which is a largely African, labor union that does amazing things. You know what they did? They built a science and technology. It's called Soltech. I visited. They invited me the other day to visit the campus. It's basically a college of science and technology, and their members, they benefit out of that. Because of the membership fees that they pay. Therefore, they built such an institution, which is a private institution, very much not controlled by government, entirely financed by private citizens. So if we can support organizations like Solidarity, right, that does such things in our communities. In its Solidarity Free Market Foundation, because of the work it does, if you want to donate, or you can donate to the Free Market Foundation. So these organizations that do amazing things that are largely kind of, are driven by private citizens, I think that can make an impact as well.
Absolutely.
John, sorry, Neil, if I can jump in there.
Sure.
I don't want to beat the queue, but I have a question for John, and then I have a question from one of the journalists in attendance. So just to John from my side, I mean, the government has established a bit of a support mechanism, obviously, throughout 2019, 2020, 2021, with small businesses which suffered because of lockdowns. But I wanted to ask for any small business owners and people in that sort of broad sphere watching, what advice, what sort of practical steps do you have for them? I mean, are there people they can reach out to get support? I mean, obviously, I'm sure that they can speak to the Small Business Institute, but I just wanted to give you a bit of space in that regard to speak to that community and how they can sort of help each other as well, and how other organizations can help them to get back on their feet, as it were.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the question. If I may, can I start with that question that I raised my hand for, which was, what can ordinary citizens do? I think Phumlane has touched on one or two of my points. But first, the political space has been dominated by a few parties. I think in this coming election, we have an opportunity, or South Africans have an opportunity of actually making this space more competitive, because part of the bigger problem has been that one party or a few parties have dominated the political space and have really become tone deaf over the years. The second one is this dislike and disinclination towards away from evidence-based policy making. We really have to embrace evidence-based policy making, whether it's legislation or policies or regulation. First, let us first identify what the problem is, and then before we layer out what the solutions are without understanding the problem. The third and the last point in this regard, I think, is around we have to face up to the elephant in the room. The state's capacity has been hollowed out over the years. I think it's a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. If the state goes to the private sector, if government goes to the private sector and join hands with the private sector, especially where it's got absolutely nothing to do with conflict of interest, allocation of tenders, but provision of services. We've seen this happening last year, for example, when the UIF couldn't pay out the tariffs grants. It was up to the private sector to help the state to get the grants going. Chris, we have set up a tools page within the Small Business Institute. And I should also say the following, that it's been heartening and refreshing to see that government has been open to other ideas. An institution like the National Treasury has been open to listening to what can be done over and above what's the old standard response puts requirements. You must be 100% South African owned, even though you operate in South Africa, you pay taxes in South Africa. Our view has been to say, please go easy on the compliance requirements. Help the SMEs first, and then help them to comply at a later stage. Once they've received your money, you know where they live, help them comply, but get the money out there as quickly as possible. One of the studies we did to assess the impact of COVID suggested that as many as 55,000 SMEs may not make it through the COVID period. Now, to put a bit of context to this, we need 39,000 sustainable SMEs every year if we are to achieve the aspiration of the NDP on jobs and GDP contribution by SMEs. So we're very far away from that. So we for this mayhem of July 18th, what we have done is we have partnered with government and the areas that were badly affected in Gauteng, Ekurhuleni, and Soweto, link them up so that they actually talk to the people on the ground instead of having committees that are so far removed from where this happened, as well as in Durban and Maritzburg, which were badly affected by the mayhem. Thank you, Chris. Sorry, Neil, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions here. One is asking about what we can learn from the performance of Mauritius, and another one mentions Lithuania's fantastic results. Lithuania is very open to trade, and the question is whether we can trade our government ministers for theirs. So I think I can address that. I think what's interesting about that one is Mauritius is in at position 11. Lithuania is now also very high, and also I see that Georgia is still in the top 10. They're in at 5 this year. I think what's interesting there is all three of those countries were openly socialist in their policies. Mauritius in the late 70s, and Lithuania and Georgia until the late 80s with the breakup of the Soviet Union. So these countries had to face dire economic positions and decide on policies. And I visited Georgia in 2014 at an economic freedom conference, and it was very interesting to listen to the president there, who had said after 10 years with Edward Shevardnadze that they were then to literally swap their policies completely, and they went openly free market. One issue was police corruption, and they came up with a novel idea of making their police stations literally transparent. They put in glass windows, and there were no rooms. You could see literally straight through the police station. And it was a wonderful symbol, I think, that showed a true change in the country. So I think in answer to that question, we can learn a lot from Mauritius, Lithuania, and Georgia. They are countries that faced very difficult problems. They had particular political ideologies, which is what we face in this country. But they show that we can change things, and for the better. All three of those countries are doing so much better these days. I think we got another question here on the NHI. I'm not sure that's relevant to the Economic Freedom of the World Conference, index.
What is the specificity of that one, Neil? I mean, we could touch on it depending on technical.
Okay, so do your speakers have any insights on the NHI, and what will the impact of its implementation be across the board for healthcare in South Africa and the economic freedom of the nation? Perhaps Chris, then, if you feel qualified enough.
I'll take it quickly. I mean, it's another example of government wanting to do good, ostensibly wanting to provide quote unquote free healthcare, but the implementation thereof will increase the cost of healthcare for all citizens. And only those very high up in the elites and with the necessary political connections will be able to go overseas to get their healthcare. So from the FMF's point of view, and we have a lot of articles, research, media releases, you can find that on www.freemarketfoundation.com regarding the NHI. But we think that a lot more hard regulation, deregulation can be done in both the public and private sectors to increase better access to healthcare. We don't think that placing the management of all healthcare in the hands of the state will lead to better outcomes for most South Africans. So that, just in a quick way to touch on that, we think that will be another way to undermine economic freedom, and it won't result in better health outcomes, especially not for poor South Africans.
No, sure. I mean, healthcare is a good like any other. It can be purchased, and the same as education. And really, if one takes one step back and say, how do you pay for such a desired good? Then you have to be looking to follow policies that generate wealth. And if we generate wealth as a country and follow the right economic policies, then those are the kind of products that we're going to be in a strong position to buy. So, but we cannot put the cart before the horse.
Neil,
the next question.
Neil, do you
go ahead, Rex?
I'd just like to add to what Chris has said. Apart from the apparently or superficially noble aims which he has attributed to the government in connection with NHI, I think the overriding principle here is one of ideology. The government is committed to following what is essentially a socialistic path, and it perceives this as being one step in that direction. And the step in that direction is far more important than the actual practical implementation thereof. Now we find ourselves in a position where the Minister of Finance, the recently appointed Minister of Finance, has said there's no money available for the basic income grant. There's no money available for various projects that the government has in mind. And in the past, even before we got to the situation in which we are at the moment, where the Treasury is actually formally announcing that the money is running out, various people who looked at the NHI said it was simply unaffordable. It is impracticable and it is unaffordable. So my view of the matter is that it won't happen for practical reasons, and that the government will try to persevere for ideological reasons, but that the practical will overcome the ideological in time.
Yes, the cupboard is in fact bare, as you say.
Yeah.
Our next question is an interesting one. It says, which political party has the best economic freedom policies? Perhaps we can interpret that as which parties have the right bag of economic policies. So, Phumlani, do you feel you'd like to tackle that one? Who's got it right?
Well, there is no perfect political party. You will never find that. I don't think you can find that in anywhere around the world. South Africa, I mean, really, there isn't a perfect party. In fact, there isn't a party that really 100% aligns to my values and principles. I struggle to find that, and I'm sure many people struggle to find such too. But you know, there is always we are always voting for the lesser evil. You know, the least worst party is what we always try and choose to govern us in the country. And I think that at this point right now, in September 2021, with the local elections coming up, I would say that when I look at the political landscape, the people who are, or the parties that are relatively sensible or are a little bit sensible when it comes to the ideas of pro-markets and so, I mean, of markets, less government, law and order. You know, I would say that the DA is sensible in comparison to the NC and the EFF. EFF is far left, of course, more of socialist sort of thinking from their part. And also the former mayor of Johannesburg as well, Herman Mashaba's Action South Africa. I've looked at his website, very critical of BEE, at least from a party perspective. That's how they're running. Very much also, you know, very much pro-business. In other words, seeing business as what should be the driver of our growth, of job creation in the country. So I would say those two at this point. There are also smaller ones, of course. I think Freedom Front Plus tends to be sensible. It's just that most people, they would not want to vote for it because it seems to be, they see it as a party of Afrikaners, largely white, and therefore they say, well, I mean, Afrikaners, why should we vote for them? So there are those dynamics as well. But I would say that I think the ones I've mentioned, they are better, not perfect, but what they say is much better than what the NC and the EFF are saying. And in terms of governance as well, when you look at evidence, I'm talking about facts that have been done. The evidence shows that the DA-run municipalities, they are better than those that are run by the NC. So we need to factor in all those things as well. So I would say that I think that the two parties I've mentioned that are quite more prominent, at least at this point, they offer or they say what is right. It's a matter of if they were in power, would they really do it? I think they would really do it, especially the DA, because we've seen that they govern better than the ANC. At least that's my view.
I think the question is complicated by the fact that within one party they don't agree on the same policies. So the question seems more difficult to answer than at first at face value. Do you think, specifically within the ANC, do you think we can see any positive movement with issues like South African Airways being privatized or the electricity industry being privatized?
Well, the energy industry is on the right track, though it's very slow. That's just my view. I think Cyril Ramaphosa's decision to sort of allow the independent power producers to produce power and sell, I think that's a good sign, because we've had sort of very disturbing blackouts over the past years. So that's one kind of reform that I think is good, though it's slow. But it's good progress. Though I doubt they will ever privatize Eskom entirely, because politicians love control. But for me, I think it's better that at least they are liberalizing the energy industry for everyone to come in and produce. In other words, be competitors to an extent. to Eskom and provide power. I think that's a good sign. Governments all over the world love airlines. They love the idea of airlines. I mean, in many parts of the world, they love control of airlines. So the SAA thing, I doubt that they will ever, no, I don't think there will ever be a point where they say, no, we are getting out of airlines as government. We are no longer intervening on owning and controlling anything there. I doubt. I mean, governments all over the world, they love the airlines industry.
Caviar.
Yes, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we appear to have exhausted all our questions. So let me just finish up with a little bit of housekeeping. I think first, let me thank everybody, our speakers, John, Pumani, Rex, and Chris. Thank you all for attending as well, to our listeners and viewers. Chris, maybe if I could just hand over to you briefly just to ask where people may find more information on the report itself. Where might they get it from, the Free Market Foundation?
Thank you, Neil, and obviously from the FMF side, thank you to everyone for your time, your insights and your expertise this morning to the speakers. So you can go to www.freemarketfoundation.com. We've just sent out a media release on this event and the EFW, so you can find all the links in that release. It should be the first item as you log onto the website, and you can also go to the Fraser website institute, fraserinstitute.com, and you can find more EFW related analysis and data on there. I think that's everything from the top of my head. Thank you.
Okay, and then from my side, just to conclude, I've been involved with the report for 18 years now, and I think it's made a tremendous contribution to being able to empirically assess policies and their effect on institutes and public institutes. And it's a pleasure, an honor for the Free Market Foundation to be involved in this project and to continue to promote this level of research. The various parameters within the report allow each country to interpret those metrics and decide on what combination of policies they want to put together and literally turn the dials on all 46 of the parameters. And it's our job to make governments understand what it is that those policy areas do and how the knobs interact with each other. And ultimately, if they all go in the right direction, that economic growth and economic wealth can be the result. Thank you again, everybody, and we appreciate your attendance, and we look forward to seeing South Africa's reception of this year's report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.